please welcome Russ Streiner and John Russo, the writer and actors from Night. Yeah, that's right, the original Night of the Living Dead, the movie that started it all. Give it up for them. I believe your microphones are on.
Yep.
Hello. Yes. Oh.
I was just reminding Russ the last time we saw him was at the Living Dead weekend in Evans City.
Yes.
Where we were doing the Q&As in the back of a flatbed trailer.
Oh, that's right.
That is true.
Yeah, and then I just... Go ahead.
First question, is there a podiatrist in the house? Johnny, as you can see, Johnny's been having a little bit of foot problems, so please bear with me. It hasn't affected my brain yet.
Awesome.
He thinks.
Now, real quick, before we get to questions from the audience, you guys are involved in like a film program with university, if I'm not mistaken?
We had a movie-making program at Du Bois Business College, but the college went out of business.
Really?
Which is unfortunate because it was the least expensive and I think the best program in the country. And the students were doing fabulous work. And it was fun doing it, other than, Russ and I had to drive to Du Bois a couple times.
Yeah, how many years did that go on?
3 or 4 times a month.
How long did that go on?
It went on for
6 or
almost
7.
5 years.
Wow.
I think it was it was at least 5 years, maybe 6 years. And it was unfortunate because, it's unfortunate that the program went out of business. The good part of the story is that there are at least 10 people that I know of who are now actively involved in the film business and making a very good living from the film business.
Excellent.
We always gave them a lot of false information just to discourage competition.
So what guy, I know I've worked with you a lot, John, with some of these, and I always wanted to ask you, what do you do in your spare time? You always seem to be working. What is your normal day?
Well, I don't quit, I just, Dave Felser was shooting commentary tracks for me because Midnight is coming out on Blu-ray, and he said, well, you're one of these guys they'll probably have to drag out of a movie set someday. And I said, well, you can relax when you're dead. It even gets easier.
John, I'm sorry, I thought you were...
That's okay. All you have to do is lie there and rot.
John maybe is too modest to discuss it, but he leaves on Monday for Los Angeles to direct at least one project. Is there another project?
Yeah, I'm directing a movie called Red Tide Massacre. And I already spent 8 days in Florida scouting locations, and then the producers decided we better shoot in LA because Florida, not because of COVID, but because of the cicadas and the hurricane season coming. So now we're shooting about 12 days in LA, and then we'll go back to Florida in November. And then there's another film that I'm slated to direct that's called, it's about zombies on a ship. I keep, and all through COVID, I just kept writing, good thing. I'd have gone nuts if I didn't have my writing, but I kind of tweaked 2 or 3 of my previous novels and wrote 2 new novels and 3 screenplays. One of them I wrote in 8 days called The Hog Lady. Anyway, so I just keep going. That's the way I like it.
I have another quick question. Did you guys know each other before Night of the Living Dead, or did you meet on the set? Did you know each other before then?
We did. George Romero and I started a production company, and we met John prior to when he went to college. Then he went away to University of West Virginia, and then into the Army, and with a brief stint as a teacher. So we were itching to get our hands on him and persuaded him once he got out of the Army, and he was a teacher, and asked him to come to work for us, and he did, and that was several years before Night of the Living Dead, and we've been friends ever since.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, it didn't take much persuasion, because all through my time in the Army, that's, that kind of dream of working with Russ and George kept me going. And it wasn't long after I got out of the Army that we all started working together. And we had, by 1967, we had our walls covered with awards for commercial work, and we had developed into a very tight-knit production group. By the time we made Night of the Living Dead, nobody needed to be told what to do. We just knew, and we kept at it. There were only basically about 6 of us, and then people like Carl and Marilyn and other George Cassana. We had helpers, but basically that movie was made with a crew of about 6 people. Wow! And now, whenever I bring any of that kind of, everybody thinks you have to have 30 or 40 people, or maybe even 100 people, and that's why Hollywood budgets are so high.
The 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead, by comparison, the original crew was 6. The remake crew was about 112.
Yeah, and the same in the original film. One of the first things that was filmed was the cemetery scenes, and then in the remake in June of 1990, one of the first things being filmed was the cemetery scene. And George and I were standing there looking at it, and we're thinking, we have 100 and some people, when we did this scene with 6 people before. We're lucky to have 6, and my personal feeling is the original's better, but
Yeah, absolutely.
Are many of you folks from Pittsburgh?
Yeah.
Oh, good. There's quite a few.
Good.
Well, in addition to being involved with Night of the Living Dead and several other endeavors, I'm also the founder and chairman of the board of the Pittsburgh Film Office, which is an office that has been open for 30 years, and that office attracts movie production to Pittsburgh. That's our sole job, is to let the rest of the industry know that Pittsburgh is a pretty damn good place to make movies. And right now, for example, there are 3 television series shooting and 2 feature films. So when we started the film office back in 1990, the local called Studio Mechanics, IATSE Studio Mechanics union had 13 members, and now they have up over 500 members, and all 500 of those people make a full-time living making movies in Pittsburgh.
Nice.
When I often say that there ought to be a statue of Russ Streiner in the middle of Pittsburgh, because these aren't burger flipper jobs. These are really good jobs of the kind we need. But when he was starting, we were actually working on the budget for the remake, and Russ said he was going to start promoting the idea of having a Pittsburgh film office. And I didn't think it would work. I thought he would never get the support, because we used to joke that investors would rather put money into a ball bearing factory than a movie, but Russ kept at it and did such a great job, him and Don Keyser and others, and now it's thriving, and it's just utterly remarkable in my opinion.
And guess what? Some of the headaches about talking to politicians about the worthwhileness of movie production being a real business hasn't gotten any easier. You would think after 30 years of black and white evidence that it's working. Some politicians still don't get it.
Well, they get it, but they get reelected by acting like the movie business in Hollywood, or that's Sodom and Gomorrah, But I think the fact is, Russ knows the statistics better than I do, but for every dollar of tax credit money that's spent bringing movies into Pittsburgh, it returns about $4, right?
It's up a little bit from that now.
And then they say, the politicians from the middle of the state, and they'll say, that money only goes to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Wrong. It's spent all over the state. The whole state benefits from the tax dollars and everything else, the hotels, the cabs, everything, the stuff that's used to build sets, and you name it, the whole state profits from that.
Oh, well, the beat goes on, and we like everybody in life. You keep plugging away until you make some progress.
You guys have some questions, right? Or do you have?
I have just a couple questions before we turn it over. I heard a story. There was a band called Parliament that George Clinton was in the 1960s. They were is this true? Because they were playing Pittsburgh in the 60s. They were pretty much inebriated after the show, and they lost their way driving away from Pittsburgh, ended up in Evans City. And they said they actually drove through part of the set while they were filming Night of the Living Dead, and they were like, couldn't believe that they were actually seeing. Is that just like urban legend, or did that really happen?
I have no idea. I used to smoke Parliament.
I think, I think it may be urban legend. What year was that?
This was about 1967.
That's when we were filming.
It could have been.
Because they said they hightailed it right out of there. They just said they saw a bunch of zombies walking around while they were driving because they wanted to ask somebody for directions.
Well, one of the things that we attempted to do when you do a movie production in a small town like Evans City, pretty soon everyone knows what's going on, and they're very curious about it, as would anybody be. And so when we had big, extravagant nights of production, like the truck blowing up when they do their big attempt to escape, we held off on doing that scene until about 3 o'clock in the morning, thinking no one will be around and safety considerations. Everyone was around in lawn chairs covered up in blankets and so forth, waiting for us to blow up the failure of the escape attempt. 3 o'clock in the morning, people were still around, so we had to film.
Well, it was the greatest thing in the world for people to show up and watch a movie being made, because it didn't happen so often, And they would go through all the stuff that we had there to eat and drink. And by the time we got done filming, there was never anything left over for us, for the crew.
So how did it end up in Evans City?
Because that's where the biggest thing was, how could we afford to make the movie if we couldn't find a house that we could destroy? So we spent some time looking for a house, and then there was a fellow named Jack Ligo who was an intern with the Late Image, our company, and he knew of this church camp. And it was a farm, then it was a church camp, then it was going to be bulldozed to turn it into a sod farm. So Russ made a deal to rent the place for $300 a month, and they didn't care what we did with it, and it was bulldozed afterwards. So,
and ordinarily, when someone is using your property to as a movie location, the contractual deal is that you will leave the property in as good or better shape than you found it. But with Night of the Living Dead, we couldn't make such a promise. So we had to find a place that didn't care. And Mr. Gass, he had such a farm. We made the arrangements, and because we didn't know. It's entirely possible that we could have set the place on fire. So, but he was very understanding, and
we did set Gary on fire.
my brother, yeah, by accident, of course.
He set himself on fire. He was squirting. You know, there were times when the chair that Ben pushes his chair out, you know, and sets it on fire to drive the ghouls back from the house. And sometimes we were shooting scenes where that chair had to be burning, and sometimes not, because, you know, movies are shot out of order. And Gary was squirting gasoline on the chair to get it reignited, but the coils of the chair must have still been hot, and they erupted, and Gary got set on fire for real, and he took off running. He panicked and ran. I yelled. I was too far away to do anything about it. Gary, fall down. And Bill Heinzman luckily tackled him and smothered out the fire, and then Gary had to go to the hospital. That was the only real accident, though, right?
Yeah. Bill Heinzman, you probably know, played the cemetery ghoul and eventually the lead ghoul in the whole film, and he was around for that. He was one of the ghouls being driven back by the fire, and he had the presence of mind to tackle Gary and put him out, but it wasn't too serious, but it could have been serious.
And when we blew up the truck, to not lose this big explosion, George was on the main camera, Russ was on another camera, and I was on the third camera. And then, you know, we all did everything. Whatever it took, we did. And like I said, nobody really needed to be told what to do. Russ shot the scene. Russ went up in the helicopter. I don't know if George was afraid of it or not, but anyway, the scenes from the helicopter, Russ did the filming.
George was a very tall guy, 5'6", or 6'5". The other way around. And in addition to being tall and lanky, he was also not too keen on going up in a helicopter that had the door removed so we could do filming from it. So that's how I ended up doing the filming for that the posse roundup sequence. George wanted no part of the helicopter.
Yeah, the other one other thing along those lines about people. Here's Dwayne, and Dwayne's playing this hero, and Dwayne was afraid of the gun, so we had to just load one blank in there at a time and hand it to him when he had to fire it, and then he'd immediately hand it back like it was, you know, going to explode on him. And when he was in the truck with the escape attempt, he's standing up in the truck with a torch or whatever, and I'm lying in the bed of the truck holding him up by his legs. You know, that kind of stuff. Little secrets that you don't know, right?
Is there anyone here in the audience who has not seen Night of the Living Dead? Looks like not a single person.
Russ usually asks that question, and I wasn't at when Night of the Living Dead got remastered by the Museum of Modern Art. There was a screening in Claremont, New Jersey, and Russ asked that question, and I guess I'll let him tell what happened. He said, anybody in here that didn't see Night of the Living Dead? And one guy stood up.
Well, there was one guy, and it turned out to be Stephen Colbert. So he was a Night of the Living Dead virgin that night.
And then a couple nights later, he opened his show with shots of Night of the Living Dead, and the Republicans were trying to kill Obamacare, and I think they had a bill to kill it, and so Colbert did a little segment probably about 3 minutes long to open the show, and it said Night of the Living Bill. And it satirized the efforts to kill Obamacare. And then he did a follow-up sometime later called Night of the Living Bill Part 2. So, just funny stuff that happens around this movie, and it just goes on and on.
All right, we got a question for you right down front here.
All righty.
When did you know you had something with this movie? I think I talked to Russ, and he was saying he didn't know until, but when did you know?
There's conflicting reports about that. And I have to say, I don't know if it's really true or not. But none of us, with the exception of John Russo, knew that it was going to become a classic. We were working our hearts out to make the best, most scary movie we could, but he now says that he knew right from day one that it was going to be an outrageous success, and I don't know to this day if that's true or not.
Well, that's a joke, but we did really believe we were making a good movie, and the first, when it came out, one of the first interviews with me and Dwayne Jones was published in the McKeesport Daily News, and right in there, I get called a brash young man because I said it was a good movie. And, I think I was right.
Okay. Another question right down here front.
How many times did you have to deliver your iconic line before it was finally iconic, if that makes sense?
Well, because we were working on such short budget money, there was not a whole lot of, if you will, extra takes, outtakes, that kind of thing. My recollection is that was, I probably said it maybe 3 times, but the overall ratio of footage that ended up in the film as opposed to footage that was shot, the overall footage ratio was about 6-to-1. So for every 6 feet of film that was shot, 1 foot made it into the film. So it was Spartan, to say the least.
And like Scorsese and Woody Allen and most Hollywood directors, they shoot everything. They'll shoot 25 or 30-to-1, and they dump it on an editor, and that's how they do their movies. Now, we were running out of film, and George was just, we would rehearse, and then a lot of times there would be only 1 take, and if that footage would have been scratched or damaged in any way in the lab, we'd have been sunk because we couldn't reshoot because the house was being bulldozed. But George did a fabulous job. He was an excellent cameraman as well as an editor and director. So,
have many of you ever had an opportunity? Did you have an opportunity to meet George? Well, that's truly too bad, because he was a unique individual and a good friend for 60 years, and we miss him a lot. He passed away in July of 2017.
Speaking of that iconic line, how many times since that you've been going to conventions and doing things have you been asked to recreate it?
It's been at least 6 or 7.
Could I trouble you for a 8th or 9th?
I think we can work that out. Well, of course, you know that Johnny, being the pain that he was to his younger sister, tormenting her. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to go to church. He didn't want to drive into the country. Basically a whiner. So, and it just seemed to be appropriate that as part of the torment, when they first notice that there's some kind of an older person coming up from the back of the cemetery, it just appeared to Johnny to continue the torment and say, "They're coming to get you, Barbara."
Awesome.
I get jealous. Nobody asked me to say my line. And when I say, well, don't you want to hear my line? And then they look puzzled, and I say, well, I'll do it anyway.
Let's get a few more questions here, right over here. Who's going to come back with a microphone?
Did you guys coordinate your suits before this? You're all in white and he's all in black.
No, it's just luck of the draw.
Just by chance.
So growing up in Pittsburgh, of course, I grew up watching Mr. Rogers. And you guys all worked for Mr. Rogers, and that's where you guys honed your skills. And I always thought I was crazy that you work for Mr. Rogers, then you make Night of the Living Dead. Did Mr. Rogers ever comment on that to any of you guys and say, interesting movie or something? I was just curious.
Well, first of all, the Latent Image, our production company, didn't do all that much with Fred Rogers. It's not like he was our only client. George, I think, shot 1 or 2 episodes for him of, I think, when he got his tonsils out, or I think that was one of the episodes. But a typical day at Latent Image, there might be 2 or 3 different jobs going on. So George was the only one that I know. Maybe you did. I don't know. I didn't do any work for Fred Rogers.
No, I was in the Army at that time. I didn't do anything. I never even met him.
But George, yeah, but George wasn't like a staff person or anything. It was, our whole business was project oriented. People would hire us to do beer commercials and amusement park commercials, and Fred Rogers hired him to do the tonsil episode. So that's more the makeup. But we honed our skills through projects like Fred Rogers, and he was a very, very dear, sweet man. I don't know if you saw the movie that Tom Hanks did, where Tom Hanks played Fred Rogers. The story was about a reporter who simply could not believe that Fred Rogers was the kind, gentle soul that he was. And he started off to do a piece of reporting on Fred Rogers to kind of pull the mask off. And it wasn't. What Fred Rogers was Fred Rogers, period. I mean, there was nothing phony baloney about him at all. He was just a kind, gentle man. And he and George hit it off beautifully.
I started laughing when Russ mentioned the beer spots because something flashed into my head about, we did a whole series of spots that ended up winning silver medals in the International Commercial Film Festival at Cannes. But before that, so Russ was on the phone with the people from the brewery, and we were going to do 8 commercials, and it was at Seven Springs on the ski slopes or whatever that each commercial had. And they said, well, how much beer are you going to need for this? Russ somehow got them to send a brewery truck and a half of beer. They sent quarts, they sent 12 ounces, they sent pony bottles, they sent every kind of mug and glass. We had beer. We would set beer out on the ledge of our building to let the snow keep it cold. We had beer for a long time after that.
I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Iron City Beer. The fact that you're local, probably a lot of you did. Well, it was a series of Iron City commercials.
I'm going to tell one other wacky story. They put us up and this was before Seven Springs was as large an installation as it is now, but it's still pretty large, And they put us up in the chalets, and the chalets were equipped with every kind of glass and every kind of dishware and everything else. They're really nice, and we're staying there with people from the agency. And Russ and George and I, we were working our butts off, but then there would be a couple hours where maybe we could relax and have a drink or something. So we're in the Chalet and we got into the whiskey. And then we got into toasting each other. It's me, George, and Russ sitting at this round oaken table. And so we did a toast, and George threw his glass over his shoulder, Russian style, into the fireplace, shatter, crash. We broke every glass in the place. We just kept going the rest of the night, toasting and tossing the glasses in the fireplace. And the agency people were asleep right down the hall. I don't know why they didn't wake up. I don't know why they didn't even fire us. That's an example of how crazy we were in our youth.
Sometimes we misbehave.
We still do.
That was another example of a job that George didn't. George did basically everything. He shot, he edited, but we had a sequence that took place in one of the indoor pools at Seven Springs that required putting cameras in underwater housings and filming underwater. George wanted no parts of that. So Bill Heinzman, who was the cemetery ghoul, he and I ended up with the assignment of doing the underwater filming on any of that. We did another film, a TV commercial for Calgon, that was a takeoff on a movie that some of you may have seen, a film that Raquel Welch was in called Fantastic Voyage, where a submarine gets shrunk down to miniature size, and we did a parody of that for Calgon, and our shrunk down submarine got submerged in a washing machine to find out why Calgon did such a great job of keeping your clothes clean, and George wanted no parts of that either. So, but that one was at the University of Pittsburgh Trees Pool, and they had viewing ports into the side of into the water, underwater, so he could stay dry and film as well.
Got time for just a few more questions. I have a question. How did Night of the Living Dead fall into public domain?
Oy.
I know it's a loaded question. It's something that I just always was curious about.
Back, the copyright laws back in those days, in 1968, was that if you presented a movie or a book or a record that did not have a copyright notice on it, you lost your rights forever, according to the law then. Well, the distributor, the Walter Reed Organization, Continental Pictures division of the Walter Reed Organization, were getting closer and closer and closer to October 1st, 1968, which was when our premiere was at the Fulton Theater. And we don't have a print, we don't have a print, we don't have a print. George Stern and his cousin Ernie Stern at Associated Theaters, it was their theater that was opening the picture as a premiere, but then the following day it went into, I think it was roughly 14 of their theaters. So print shows up in the afternoon of October 1st, and we hadn't screened the picture. We screen it, and there was no copyright on it. The distributor, either through error or on purpose, left the copyright notice off. And I'll let Jack pick up on the story there, because we realized at that time that we had a bit of a problem on our hands. And then Jack discreetly called the Copyright Office the following day to find out, is there any way around this, so he can pick up the story from there.
Yeah, we got really bad information from the Copyright Office itself. One of their attorneys was on the phone with me and told me that the copyright would be lost and there was nothing we could do about it, except that that's not true. by law, even then, if a third party neglected to put your copyright notice on your work, it wasn't your fault, and that we could have registered it at that point. So then it fell mostly to me and Russ for all these years to fight the battle about copyright, and we actually did secure a registration that remained active until 1995, and because we had that registration, we were able to make the deal on the remake and some other deals to force people to pay us. And then in 1995, some new person came into the Copyright Office and decided that she should revoke our copyright, and so it just got into more battles until finally, and this is a brief story, I mean, the files are that thick, you know. I mean, it was just total agony for me and him for all these years, gut-wrenching agony to have to fight all these battles against pirates and everybody else. And then finally, the Museum of Modern Art did the remastering of the movie, which has a valid copyright. So that's the story in a thumbnail sketch.
So today, Night of the Living Dead does have the restored version, the 4K version, does have a valid copyright.
Awesome. We'd like to thank you guys. We're running a little late, but I just can't thank you enough for coming out, sharing these stories, getting to tell all these folks about what a great, iconic film you guys were behind. Please give it up. Russ Streiner, John Russo.
If you didn't have a chance
Thank you very much.
If you didn't have a chance to get a question asked, they're going to be at their table right outside the event room. Feel free to stop by, talk to them, get some autographs, get some signed merchandise. Thanks again, Russ Streiner and John Russo.
Excellent. Good job, everybody.
Hi, this is Michael Shanks, and you're watching Fandom Spotlight. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The fate of the universe may depend on it. And have fun and follow your fandom.